So welcome. This is our third Changemakers meeting. It's today we're going to talk about how can I make sure my event is accessible to everyone. A lot of you I know came to part one, and we decided to kind of in the moment that it would make more sense to do this as two separate workshops. So this is basically the second part of the Introduction to Access Needs and Disability Justice 101. That's the wrong date. Today is August 4th, and we'll be talking about access needs, but that'll be in the second part of the presentation. We'll do a little bit more on disability justice and a quick review to start with. So again, we have this quote by Judy Heumann that I liked so much, I'm using it a second time. Most things are possible when you assume problems can be solved. And for those of you who don't know Judy Heumann, definitely look her up. She did some amazing work around getting the ADA and other disability rights passed. And we strive to be an actively accessible space. Zoom can be difficult to engage with for long periods of time. So if you need to turn off your camera or leave and come back or leave completely, please feel welcome to do whatever feels right for you in the moment. If at any point your access needs are not being met or you need something in order to feel more comfortable, please feel welcome to do whatever you need to do, including standing up, stretching, leaving, using the bathroom, etc. If you need anything from me, please let me know, or better yet, please let the access person know, and we can communicate that way. Also, we have a wonderful ASL person today. Thank you, Molly, and thank you, Hara, for making that possible. So please speak slowly so that our wonderful ASL student interpreter can keep up. So yeah, let's do intros. I am going to close out the screen in a second and put this in the chat. If you can share your name, your pronouns, what you're wearing or look like, as well as your access needs. So what you need in order to be as comfortable as possible in the space. The idea being that everyone has access needs. So if yours are met, please say my needs are met. And then we have just a quick little prompt question. How do you show the people around you that they are welcome in your space? So just a little bit about who I am briefly. My name's Anna Flurry, as I mentioned. I grew up in Prescott and I attended Granite Peak Unitarian Congregation, which is where I first got introduced to social justice, and that would shape the rest of my life. So at this point, I've been actively working in nonprofits and organizing spaces for about 9 years. Most recently, I worked as a paralegal and social services coordinator at an immigration nonprofit in the Bay. I also worked at Reclaim Ugly, which is an organization dedicated to rewriting and decolonizing our understandings of beauty from white supremacy, patriarchy, transmisogyny, fat phobia, ableism, and other systems of oppression. And I mention that in particular because that was a space where everyone who was working there or volunteering there was disabled. So learning how we could support each other within that space and within doing the kind of work we were doing was definitely a learning experience. And I really gained a lot from that experience, and I'm grateful for it. So I've been kind of on a lifelong journey to find out what I can about social justice and how change really happens. So that was the impetus for creating the Changemaker Workshops. And my goal here, I don't pretend to have all the answers at all, but I do want to share with you all some ideas that I've picked up over the years, because I think that they're not really accessible for everyone. And I think that the ability to create positive change in our world should be something that is as accessible as possible to everyone. So I also identify as disabled. I also have ADHD, and so this workshop I think has been really fun to put together because I've learned a lot of things over the years from disabled scholars, organizers, friends that I have had the privilege to know, and I'm really excited to share with you all. So as you probably know, the Changemaker Workshops are monthly workshops for people who care about the world and want to learn skills to take meaningful action in our communities. Our goal here is to help you develop the skills to build and engage with radical, resilient, connected communities, and to be able to take action on issues that are important to you. As I mentioned, I don't claim to be an activist. I'm sorry, I don't claim to be an expert. I do claim to be an activist. Yeah, so I really want this to feel as much as possible like a skill sharing space rather than a teacher-student space. Today there is kind of a portion that's really a lot of like just like reading things that I've passed along. So I'll try to make that as engaging as possible. Yeah, and if I'm wrong about something or you have something to add, please be sure to speak up. I'm constantly learning how to better create collaborative spaces where knowledge can be shared and the learning never stops. So today we're going to talk about disability justice and accessibility, which at its core is about making sure that all people are welcome and celebrated participants in a space. So just quick acknowledgements and contributions. The Disability Justice Culture Club is a group that I know I was connected with in the Bay Area. I learned a lot from them. You can find them here. India Harville in the Embrace Body, and Leslie EXP, who we watched the video of last time. And if you haven't seen part 1 yet, I will share that recording again with folks in the follow-up email, and I'll also share these links. I also want to mention my teachers. Stacy Park Milburn was a Korean American disability rights activist. She helped create the disability justice movement and advocated for fair treatment of disabled people. And this is a picture of her. And she has light skin, dark hair that's shaved on the sides and short on top, pink glasses, is smiling and looking at the camera, wearing a collared white shirt that's striped yellow and white. And I always forget the name of it, but has a tool around her neck that will help her to speak, is sitting in a wheelchair, and there's red roses in the background. Another important influence, India Harville, as a disability justice consultant, public speaker, somatics practitioner, and performance artist. India Harville has made it her mission to open people's minds to the wonder of their own bodies. So there's a picture of India Harville here. She's dark-skinned with black dreadlocks, is smiling at the camera, has an olive green dress on, and her service dog, who's a lab, is in her lap. And the service dog is wearing a blue vest. She's sitting in a wheelchair with lots of greenery in the background. And also my disabled friends and disability justice community have been really influential. So there's a photo of the Disability Justice Culture Club, which is a group of people of many different body sizes, skin color, hair textures, sitting under an orange tree, talking and laughing with a service dog in the foreground. And there's another photo, image, they're both drawings, with several people, again, with various abilities and using different mobility devices, holding up signs that say disability justice is social justice. And I mentioned teachers in particular because especially in disability justice, often people are creating really world-changing knowledge, and just literally by existing as disabled people in the world, I think we do a lot to contribute towards creative problem solving and different things like that. And often people are not compensated for their time, or they're not compensated enough for their time. So I think it's really important to name people and to lift them up and to give you opportunities to donate, which I will send in the follow-up email. So quick agenda for today. Well, this is from last time, so that's wrong. Where we're doing intros and welcome, I'll quickly go through the covenant and group agreements. Then I'll just do a quick review of disability justice, which I'll probably go through pretty quickly since we spent a good chunk of time on that in part 1. And then there will be a period where I'm going to be talking about or sharing videos about eugenics. So if that is something that is triggering or not something that feels good for you in your body right now to be here for, I'll let you know in advance and you can leave and come back for that part. Then we'll do a group break, which I will try to make 30 minutes, time depending. Then we'll do a quick and dirty guide to creating accessible spaces. And again, I'll try to make that as engaging as possible. And then we'll close. So I'm just going to go ahead and read the covenant and group agreements. We are a welcoming space for people who are femme, Black, Indigenous, people of color, trans people, non-binary people, and people of all body shapes, sizes, beliefs, and abilities. And I'm tired of hearing my own voice. Kelsey, would you like to read the rest of this?
We strive to center the experiences, voices, and wisdom of the people who have experienced the most marginalization in our communities wherever possible, and especially when speaking about the issues that affect folks directly. In order to create as loving a community as possible, there is no space here for white supremacy, body shaming, transphobia, ableism, classism, or patriarchal behavior. In situations where the comfort of one party would come at the expense of the safety of another party, we will always prioritize safety over comfort. No one is perfect, and we understand that we are each on our own journeys to become our better selves, and that mistakes will happen. When they do, we are building a community where we each strive to approach the situation with openness to difficult conversations rather than defensiveness, with a desire to grow, with time to reflect and learn, and with a focus on healing, love, and trust building. We believe that together we can build a compassionate community of trust and care for one another. By being a part of this community, we make a commitment to show up as our best selves and to strive for open and caring communication, growth, healing, and love in all things.
Thank you. Okay, so just a quick review of part 1. I've included the link here. I need to change the text color for this. It is not very legible, but I will send that out to you all. So a quick review of what body autonomy is, which I think is really what's at the core of disability justice. According to the United Nations Population Fund, body autonomy means having the right to make decisions over one's own life and future, which fundamentally means being able to access the safety, resources, and information needed to make those decisions. And this is where I think, for me, like the body autonomy piece of disability justice is where you really see the overlap and the importance that disability justice has to all of our movements, because it's really what it's about is, these fundamental rights. So a quick definition of social justice. Could I have someone volunteer to read this, please?
Don't all speak at once.
How about
I think
Joe?
Maria.
Oh, Maria's. Okay, whoever.
The disability justice definition from Sins Invalid.
I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay. Disability justice activists, organizers, and cultural workers understand that able-bodied supremacy has been formed in relation to other systems of domination and exploitation. The histories of white supremacy and ableism are inextricably entwined, created in the context of colonial conquest and capitalist domination. One cannot look at the history of U.S. slavery, the stealing of indigenous lands, and U.S. imperialism without seeing the way that white supremacy uses ableism to create a lesser/other, in quotes, group of people that is deemed less worthy/able/smart/capable. Ellipses. We can only truly understand ableism by tracing its connections to heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, and capitalism. The same oppressive systems that inflicted violence upon Black and Brown communities for 500 plus years also inflicted 500 plus years of violence on bodies and minds deemed outside the norm and therefore dangerous. Another ellipsis. A disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential. All bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them. All bodies are confined by ability, race, gender, sexuality, class, nation state, religion, and more, and we cannot separate them. And then it gives the link.
Thank you for sharing that. So as I mentioned, we did a much deeper analysis of this last time, but really at its core, disability justice, kind of what all those big words mean, is that they're radical and intersectional. So radical meaning it's about pulling things up at the root, not just treating symptoms, and intersectional meaning that we have to understand it with the intersection of different identities. So people with overlapping system impacted identities and the same, people exist with overlapping system impacted identities and with the same root causes that enable white supremacy, sexism, transphobia, and xenophobia are also the root causes of ableism. We have to pull things out by the root. So that's kind of just like a very quick definition of a very big subject, which is disability justice. So last time we also talked about the medical, social, and less exploitable models of disability, which Leslie XP shared in their video. Could I have a volunteer to read those out, please?
I can do it.
Thanks.
Yeah. Medical, social, and less exploitable of disability. Oh, the video by Leslie. Medical model, a person's disability is a problem with their body that needs to be fixed. In quotes. Quote, dehumanizing for the many disabled people who don't think they have a problem. And quote, history of subjecting people to invasive, impractical, or even deadly medical interventions for conditions considered disabling, but which pose no mortal threat. Social model, it's a problem with society, quote. Also known as the quote minority model, has an insidious neoliberal bias which can often deny the reality of disability in a capitalist society. Literally not possible for some people to make it accessible for them to work.
Thank you. And then I'll go ahead and read the last one, which is Marta Russell's Social Theory of Disability Derived from Labor Relations, which is the model, which was conveniently coined by Leslie XP, a much simpler, less exploitable model. So that model understands disability as really just meaning disabled to work full time. So this is much more in line with the disability justice model. It posits that a difference in condition is not even medicalized as a disability until it interferes with one's ability to do labor. So the idea being I am unemployable, less exploitable, and therefore disabled. So less, this like inherent thing and more like you are disabled by society as a transitive verb, in that you are unable to fully participate in the way that's expected in order to literally survive in a capitalist society. So I linked the video here. Highly recommend watching the full thing if you have time after this. We also talked about impairment versus disability last week. Joe, do you want to read out that quote?
Yeah. Is that me? Oh, okay. Yeah. Impairment versus disability. I really like separating out impairment from disability. So impairment as physical or neurological manifestation, like what's real. I have a physical impairment, and disability is what society creates as a barrier because of impairment. When I'm in a place where my access needs are being met, then my impairment isn't so significant. Stacy Park, Melbourne.
Thank you. So again, we talked about that more in depth, and I'm just going to kind of keep going. So what is ableism? Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normality, intelligence, excellence, desirability, and productivity. These constructed ideas are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, misogyny, colonialism, imperialism, and capitalism. We're not going to go like all in depth into all of these things. We will talk about eugenics a little bit today. And yeah, this is a very in-depth quote. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable and worthy based on a person's language, appearance, religion, and or their ability to satisfactorily reproduce, excel, and quote, behave. You do not have to be disabled to experience ableism. And this quote is white and light yellow text on a dark purple background. It comes from a working definition by Talila T.L. Lewis, updated January 2021. Okay, so before we get into eugenics, fun subject. So just, warning that that will be our next subject. Did anyone have any thoughts? I know we just covered a lot of ground, especially for those of you who were not here for part one. So just wanted to offer a few minutes to kind of process that if anyone had any thoughts. We'll give it about 5 minutes of conversation. So yeah, just a content warning before we move forward. We're going to be talking about policing, eugenics, violence towards disabled people. So if you would like to leave and come back, we'll be done with this part in about 10 to 15 minutes. Yeah, we won't show any disturbing photos or anything like that. But just that's what we'll be talking about. So let me, okay, sorry.
As a new widow, Sarah Rosas Garcia was already struggling to support her 9 children when her oldest daughter was picked up by local authorities. Andrea Garcia had been accused of skipping school and being sexually promiscuous, so the authorities responsible for juvenile delinquents committed her to a state hospital. After being administered an IQ test and assigned a low score, the doctors made their verdict. They told Sarah her 19-year-old daughter would be sterilized to prevent passing on what the state saw as a mental deficiency. This horrific tale may sound like a story from an authoritarian regime, but in fact, it took place in Southern California in 1938. And Andrea Garcia was one of thousands of poor women of color targeted by the state's relentless campaign of eugenics. Since ancient Greece, there have been efforts to control human populations via reproduction, retaining some traits and removing others. But in the 19th century, the discovery of evolution and genetics inspired a new scientific movement dedicated to this endeavor. In 1883, British scientist Sir Francis Galton named this idea eugenics, drawing from the Greek word for to be well born. This wave of modern eugenicists included prominent scientists and progressive reformers who believed they could improve society by ensuring that only desirable traits were passed down. However, their definition of what traits were and were not desirable was largely determined by the prejudices of their era. Entire categories of people were considered unfit for reproduction, including immigrants, people of color, and people with disabilities. Meanwhile, their ideal genetic standard reflected the movement's members, white Europeans of Nordic or Anglo-Saxon descent. As the influence of eugenics spread in the early 20th century, many countries restricted immigration and outlawed interracial unions. These measures to improve so-called racial hygiene were taken to their horrific conclusion in Nazi Germany. The Nazi eugenics campaign systematically killed millions of Jews, as well as individuals from other groups, including Roma, gay men, and people with disabilities. Outside their extreme brutality, however, Nazi eugenic policies reflected similar standards across the globe. Throughout the mid-20th century, many countries enacted eugenics policies, and governments in Sweden, Canada, and Japan forcibly sterilized thousands of individuals. Sterilization was exceptionally common in the U.S. From 1907 to 1979, U.S. policies enforced the sterilization of over 60,000 people, with 32 states passing laws that mandated sterilization for men and women deemed mentally defective. This label was typically applied based on superficial mental health diagnoses and the results of IQ tests, which were linguistically and culturally biased against most immigrant populations. These racist standards were particularly problematic in California. From 1920 to 1945, Latina women were 59% more likely to be sterilized than other women, and the rate of sterilizations in California was incredibly high. This single state performed over 1/3 of the country's sterilization operations. Such was the case of Andrea Garcia, whose story reflects thousands of individuals with similar fates. With the help of famed civil rights lawyer David Marcus, Andrea's mother argued that California's sterilization law violated the U.S. Constitution, depriving Andrea of her rights to equal protection under the law. However, while one of the 3 judges overseeing the case voted to spare Andrea, the other 2 did not. Records suggest it's possible Andrea escaped the impending surgery, but many more victims of these policies did not. Although eugenics acquired negative connotation after the horrors of World War II, many of its practices, including sterilization, continued for decades. By the late 1960s, research into human genetics was more nuanced, and bioethics had begun to blunt eugenics' influence. Yet Sweden and the US continued to pursue involuntary sterilization well into the 70s. Finally, class action lawsuits and protest marches in the US galvanized lawmakers, and California's sterilization laws were finally repealed in 1979. Unfortunately, today, the legal and illegal sterilization of many oppressed communities still continues around the globe. How did IQ tests come to be used as a tool of eugenics? Dig into how these tests have been used and misused throughout history with this video.
Fun stuff. She said sarcastically. So eugenics are basically the idea that, in air quotes, better people should be able to reproduce to better the human race, with, of course, obvious issues with that. It's fueled by the idea at its core that some people are more valuable and desirable than others. So eugenics language, unfortunately, is very much alive today. Things like you hear people say things like stupid people shouldn't be able to reproduce as a joke, but there's a very violent and horrendous history that is behind that. Even the word overpopulation, I think, can be used as eugenics language when you think about who's overpopulation, who are we considering as overpopulating? And again, with Roe v. Wade, these kinds of ideas of body autonomy, again, are really important in this moment. And eugenics disproportionately affect Black and Brown people. So what does eugenics look like today? These are a couple news articles. Some of you may remember in September of 2020, a whistleblower in Georgia claimed a high number of hysterectomies at an ICE facility. So one screenshot here is from NPR. It says whistleblower in Georgia claims high number of hysterectomies at ICE facility. Another screenshot is from BBC. It says ICE whistleblower, nurse alleges hysterectomies on immigrant women in the US. And actually this whistleblower has faced being blacklisted in Georgia since then, since whistleblowing about these hysterectomies at ICE facilities. So at its core, eugenics is about whose bodies and decisions are valued and whose are not. As we saw on the previous slide, eugenics and forced sterilization unfortunately continues to this day, whether or not it's legal. The legacy also can look like incarceration, voters' rights, and how certain decisions around triage have been made during high COVID surges. So when there weren't enough hospital beds, and we've had, surges since then where that's again been an issue, this literally becomes a life and death issue, especially for people with disabilities and people who are fat. I've included a link to a really good article about this that talks about the assumptions about overall health, quality of life, and social utility of people with disabilities who are influenced by, which influences triage decisions in some situations. And for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, triage means basically deciding who gets care and who doesn't when there's not enough for everyone. So, and then some more statistics about disability in this country. People with disabilities are the largest minority group in the US, making up an estimated 20% of the population. Half of people killed by the police in the US are people with disabilities. That's not something that I think is really talked about enough in the defund police movements. Yeah. And that especially for folks with mental health issues. Disability benefits hover, so like if you're quote on disability, hover at what is determined to be poverty level, which is currently $12,140 per year. I think that was from a video from 2020. Once you depend on government for money, you are not only less likely to live above the poverty line, but you're functionally no longer allowed to do so. So in the United States, you can't legally have more than $2,000 in your bank account and still receive benefits. And this is from the video by Less Exploitable Leslie. Over 65% of working age adults with disabilities are unemployed. Of these working adults, nearly 1/3 earn an income below the poverty level. And people with disabilities are astronomically more likely to experience violent crimes and abuse. So that is the reality. I think that certain issues and certain groups of people get focused on often in our social justice spaces. And unfortunately, disability rights are often swept to the sidelines. So I think it's really important for folks to know these things. So yeah, what do these larger societal attacks on disabled people have to do with creating more accessibility in our own spaces? This is a group question. Yeah, and I think that that's important to talk about because I think another word for what you're talking about is like a scarcity mentality, the idea that there's not enough for everyone, which there's not enough for everyone to live as extravagantly as I think some folks do, but there is enough for everyone to get their needs met, you know. And I think that that's something that you know, we're told that story time and time again to justify all sorts of, you know, greedy, violent behavior, I think. So I think in this context, yeah, talking about scarcity and resisting the idea that that there's not enough for everyone, and really living like, you know, what does our world look like if we move from a place of believing that there is enough for everyone, and like you said, figuring out how to distribute those resources. Absolutely. Yeah, and one more thought to leave you all with. We talked about this a little bit in the Radical Imagination workshop. So going back to that question, what do these larger societal attacks on disabled people have to do with creating more accessibility within our own spaces? One of the models of emergent strategy, which is a concept put out by Adrienne Marie Brown, is the idea that we have the power to create microcosms of the worlds that we want to live in. So creating accessible spaces and having disabled voices and bodies centered within those spaces is one way that we can create like a miniature version of the larger world that we want to build in. And just by creating that within ourselves, it creates change, it creates ripple effects in the world. And I think is world changing. Yeah, so go ahead and share my screen again. Oops. So yeah, so these things can be very heavy to talk about, and we're about to go into break after the next couple slides. So I invite you to kind of take a moment to be with whatever's coming up for you with those kinds of emotions, and to let them move through your body, because it is heavy, and I think it's important that we honor that. All right, so a big part of creating accessible spaces is normalizing needs, normalizing the fact that everyone has needs, everyone. And so something we can ask ourselves is, in a sort of normative environment, whose needs are normalized and whose are not, and how do we challenge those normalized needs? How do we center disabled bodies? So this is a graphic that I pulled from a website that I have to look up and cite. But what is accessibility? So in an accessible space, the idea is that a person with a disability can acquire the same information, engage in the same interactions, enjoy the same services in an equally effective, equally integrated manner with substantially equivalent ease of use as a person without a disability. So yeah, I would complicate this perhaps a little bit, but I'm curious about what folks think about this definition of accessibility. Yeah. And I think one thing I might say to complicate this is this use of the word same, because I think that with disability justice, the whole point is that we're not the same. We have different needs. So we may not be able to engage in the exact same interactions, but having options that are accessible to us in order to be as fully able to participate as possible, I think is something to point out here. You look like you have thoughts on that. Yes, I love that. I love what you're saying about making assumptions. So resisting the urge to make assumptions and to think that we know ahead of time, and checking in, centering the desires and wants and needs of people with disabilities as we are communicating them, as we share them. So making space for those wants and needs to be shared. I love that. Yeah, communication. Funny how it always comes down to that. Yeah, definitely. And I think that begs the question, what about when the laws or the rules don't meet everyone's needs? What, and if we've lost that line of communication, then I think you're right. I think there's a real loss there.
Okay. Yeah.
Any other thoughts? Yeah, it really is. Yeah, I feel like we keep circling back to this communication, because I think you're right. Like we're gonna go through just kind of like a lot of different like basic access needs that you can sort of like plan for, but it's impossible to know what everyone's access needs are. And yeah, and I think another thing with access needs is again making the space as accessible as possible for people. For example, like some people, that accessibility may be like, it's socially okay for me to leave halfway through and not come back, so, or it's socially okay for me to like fall asleep during a meeting, whatever it is, right? So yeah, so I just think, yeah, that communication and the consistent communication, because access needs change too, right? Yeah, I like that we're focusing on that. That's cool. So these were just a couple more thoughts I had on accessibility. Again, centering that assumption that everyone has access needs. So if you are someone who can currently walk, you have access needs that are there, but they're met. You don't have to think about, climbing up a step or whether there's guardrails or things like that. But that doesn't mean that you don't have access needs. And I think access needs are anything that makes a space or community somewhere where people can participate to the fullest extent. And then again, centering disabled people, which I think we talked about all of this basically. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, two things are coming up for me in this discussion. I think the first one is, again, that centering the voices and needs of the person who is disabled, because everyone has different desires. Some people will want to be offered help, some people will not want to be offered help, and you're not going to know that unless you communicate about it. And I think the other thing is a culture shift, and that's deeper, like more long-term work. So I think having a culture shift where, again, back to that, like normalizing needs, in a capitalist society, well, I won't use the buzzword here. In our society, I think that like we have this disconnect from our bodies. It's almost like embarrassing to have like bodily needs. Like think about the way that we talk about like using the bathroom, you know, it's like, oh, let me go powder my nose or whatever, you know, like there's this like sort of embarrassment about the fact that we have bodies almost, you know, that I think is sort of connected to that idea of normalizing needs. So I wonder what a culture would look like that normalizes those more. Yeah. Right. And the reality is that the vast majority of people will eventually at some point in their lives be disabled, you know, like eventually, hopefully we all get old, right? and we have more needs as we get older, right? And I think that is, I think that's again where there's like intersection where with disability and ageism comes in. And so I think, you know, considering that is also really important. So there's a lot to consider here. I'm going to let us break. When an organization is seeking board members who center impairment, what can it do to find members who speak accurately and effectively to these issues? What experience/skills would it be looking for? Does the board member need to have experienced a disability? If so, how does the organization approach a person to invite them on the board? Yeah, good questions. We're gonna kind of talk about those. Does anyone have any responses to that? Yeah, and I think a barrier to having disabled people in spaces is the spaces being accessible in the first place. You know, it's like a catch-22 sometimes. So, you know, doing whatever we can, whether or not disabled folks are already involved, to create accessibility in order to make it a more welcoming space, I think will be generative. That would be sort of my general answer to that. And I think that's going back to that the social model versus less exploitable model. You know, like the reality is that no matter how many access needs you try to meet, there are some people who aren't able to work, period, you know, or aren't able to work in certain ways or function within a capitalist society. So yeah, so there's like disability in the workplace, and then there's disability in organizations. And I think you're right, Peter, there's a difference in terms of like, if it's not about profit, you know, what we're able to do and what kinds of what we can value. And yeah, let's answer. I see you have your hand up. Yeah, I think it's a good question. One thing that brings up for me is perhaps tangential, but feels related. Is the idea of hiring less for skill and hiring with the intention to train. So like, so, you know, even if you did find someone who had the lived experience, but maybe not as deep on and practicing things, maybe there's a way to train or things like that. But yeah, but I think I like that word, lived experience.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, if you consider that access needs are always changing and we're always learning more, you know, I wonder whether there is like a set goal or whether it's more about the process and the learning and the continuing to build, you know, better and better as we can. Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So if you haven't already, if you could grab, well, we're either going to do this as sort of like an imagined thing, or if it's helpful for you to draw during this, I encourage you to grab some drawing materials, some paper and pen. So what we're going to do is basically, I'm framing the sort of next part as creating our dream disability spaces. So I this time around wasn't able to come up with a way that didn't just involve kind of a lot of throwing information at folks. It's not the way I prefer to, it's not as generative, but I feel like there's just some like hard hard stuff that's really useful to just kind of write down and have. So I encourage you to like literally imagine or draw like an outline or a picture of the space that you're thinking about. So it could be a space in your life, it could be an imagined space. Maybe you like down the line want to create a community center, or you want to make your house more accessible, or you want to make your church or auditorium more accessible, or whatever it is. Kind of envision that. If it feels good to you, you can write it, you can draw it on a piece of paper, and add in pieces of accessibility to this. So like literally like draw in a ramp or draw in the bathroom stalls. If that's something, if that's the way that you think, or you can imagine these things as we're talking about them, sort of building them in the space, or you can take notes, whatever works best for you. Just wanted you all to have some options for kind of envisioning like an existing space that you're a part of, or a potential space, and like what it might look like to be more accessible. And maybe some of these spaces already are very accessible, which I hope they are. But yeah, get creative, make this prompt work best for the way that you think. And as I mentioned before, all of these slides will be available to you after, so please don't feel pressured to like write down every single word. I will share these slides with you. And I'm pretty sure we're not going to be able to get through all of them. So what I'm going to do is we're going to get through as many as we can, keeping in mind that, pace and space is really important in disability spaces. And what I will do is after we finish up here, I will record the rest of them, just kind of running through them, and I'll share the recording with you and let you know like what parts we missed in the workshop. So without further ado, this is a quick and dirty starter guide to creating accessible spaces, of course, keeping in mind that it's an ongoing project. So I wanted to start by having us look at the reading for pages 28 through 32 of Skin, Tooth, and Bone. This book is called Skin, Tooth, and Bone, The Basis of Movement in Our People. It's a disability justice primer. So let me put this in the chat for you.
Just got it.
Oh yeah, boy, so many options. Chat. Okay, there it is. So there is a link. I will also pull it up on screen. Let me know if you have any issues accessing it. You should be able to just click on it. And we're just going to read the first few pages and popcorn it. So this book is this really amazing guide I found online. I actually purchased it for Granite Peak, and you can get the PDF for $7 buckaroonies on the Sins Invalid website. And it's just like basically like everything you need to know to get started with disability justice, and it has a whole really long section on just on creating accessible spaces. So if you're someone who's like working to create accessible spaces, I definitely recommend also like looking through this. It's a pretty quick read. It took me like 20 minutes maybe to get through all of those parts. We won't go through all of that today, but just want to let you know that's a resource and it's really wonderful. So I'm thinking what we'll do is for each section, each section that has the bold part at the beginning, we'll just go down the line. So for me, that's Peter, then Maria, or Joe, then Maria, then Kelsey, then Fred, then Mary. If you all can see the screen, if you can't or don't want to read, just say pass. And I'll just get us started, and then Joe will do the next section if that's okay with you, Joe. So access suggestions for public events. What will make your event accessible, and who is it accessible to? So many things determine who shows up for an event and who isn't able to, including free time, money, childcare, transportation, availability of interpreters, wheelchair access, use of fragrances, food options, and more. This guide is intended to help organizers think through ways to include a spectrum of people with and without disabilities in your public event. Please note these suggestions are not comprehensive. Each guideline will hopefully prompt folks to think through the multitudes of access barriers in the world and how we can best disrupt them to create liberated zones, areas where we aren't constantly suffering from disability oppression. So Joe, if you want to go next.
You want me to read the section?
Yeah, starting with general guidance regarding access.
Okay. General guidance regarding access. Access for all community members takes time as well as commitment. If we want our gathering to be more accessible to more people, then think ahead. The longer in advance we consider these issues, the more likely we can address them. Remember that improving access is always a work in progress, and we all have to start where we are. So wherever we are at is a great place to start. We hope organizers will incorporate what they can from these suggestions, and then next time incorporate a little more. This is how we grow together.
Maria, would you like to go next? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, I'm mute challenged. We live in a capitalist, ableist world. That means that, unfortunately, there is often a price tag that goes along with access. Individuals with disabilities should not be responsible for this cost. If you're an organization with a budget, pay attention to what gets prioritized. Know that some access needs can be expensive, so create a plan to ask for financial support if needed and find creative ways to make things work.
Cool. Kelsey.
It's important to be non-defensive when receiving feedback. We often reinforce and replicate ableism, even when we are trying hard not to. Apologize and work on finding solutions. Defensiveness creates unnecessary barriers. Sometimes people leave movements or communities, or stop attending events when they're met with defensiveness. So please be receptive to feedback and give thanks for the gift that it is.
Fred, would you like to go next?
Include, let's see, I'm muted, right?
Oh, no, you're good.
Okay. Include access information on promotional materials. Access information is as important as information about the cost of tickets. Our promotional material should state what access needs have been addressed, i.e. ASL interpretation, wheelchair access, etc. And ask people to write or call to inquire about specific accessibility concerns. Asking people what they need to participate is a great place to start. And could I add transportation to that list?
That's really good. Thank you. Mary, are you able to see the screen?
I can, thank you.
You're welcome.
Everyone has access needs, and they can be talked about without shame. It's okay, for instance, to verbalize a need to have a running heater or a meeting location close to public transit. Practicing speaking up about our own access needs increases the likelihood that our needs will be met.
Access support can be shared. I love this. Although some access needs, such as ASL interpretation, may require someone skilled in a particular field, other forms of access support can be done collectively. This can look like tag teaming note-taking or taking turns preparing plates of food. Think about our own needs while also thinking about how we can help others with theirs. Maria, can you go again?
Designate an access committee. Also designate at least 1 or 2 access coordinators to address needs at the event. The larger the group of attendees, the more important this becomes because it gets harder to meet everyone's needs as they emerge. Have designated volunteers who can troubleshoot and find creative ways to respond to challenges that arise.
Kelsey. You're muted.
Try to avoid isolating disabled people from our friends and communities. If there is an accessible seating section, assume that not only people with disabilities will want to sit there, but our friends will as well. If there's a shuttle or van to help disabled people get from one place to another, assume that we will likely be in a group, and it's possible there will be more than one wheelchair user in the group. Try not to let an access plan rely on the assumption that only one person will need an accommodation. If there's limited space, perhaps ask people to identify their party size ahead of time.
Joe.
Have disabled people on the organizing team. This makes accessibility a more organic process, identifying the potential pitfalls early on and shifting the idea that disabled people are only recipients of accommodation. Disabled people can create accessibility for each other.
Mm-hmm. Fred.
What does that mean? I don't understand. Disabled people can create accessibility for each other. What are they suggesting?
So the idea being that, like, you know, for example, someone with ADHD could describe what's happening in a video to someone who's sight impaired, and someone who's sight impaired could, you know, help make it more interesting for someone with ADHD. I don't know. That's just off the top of my head.
Okay, I got the idea. Okay.
Yeah, the idea that we can help each other.
Right.
Fred, would you like to read the next one?
Reflect on our own access needs. Even if we have never thought of ourselves as disabled, we can think about our own access needs and how they impact our experience of events. We can use our experiential knowledge as useful clues of what might be supportive for others. Like if you're short.
Mary, you want to close us out with the last bit?
Hold compassion for ourselves and everyone else in the process. Sometimes, even with the best planning, some access needs go unmet. A little humility goes a long way in addressing the frustration that ableism creates.
Mm-hmm. Love that.
Yep.
So when we're creating accessible spaces, so this being sort of from the perspective of an organizer, I think a really important thing to ask ourselves is, who is my intended audience? So even for those of us who are disabled, we often imagine our event like default audience as an abled audience. So for example, while I was doing this workshop, I had to consistently keep reminding myself to center disabled and neurodivergent/neurodiverse people as the imagined participants, rather than thinking about this as a workshop teaching abled people how to include us, if that makes sense. So it's like an internalized, you know, ableism thing. We don't even realize we're doing it. But I think that this is a useful question in a lot of different situations, asking yourself, who are you imagining the audience as? So inclusion and tolerance, I have a personal pet peeve with these words. I'm not going to like speak for the whole disabled community, but I think that both of these words kind of imply an in-group, and therefore an out-group. So I like to use words more like, you know, I don't know, creating collective community, or sort of something that like implies that we are all in us, you know. Yeah, it continues to center dominant or default bodies as the implied in-group. So yeah, so questions to ask ourselves also, what would our spaces look like if we assumed that everyone in the audience had physical disabilities? What would our spaces look like if we assumed that everyone in the audience had, that's supposed to say cognitive disabilities or neurodivergent folks? And also, I think it's really important for us to remember that creating disability-friendly spaces almost always has positive impacts for non-disabled people too. And also, as we mentioned before, temporarily abled people can become disabled at any time. We talked about this already, asking about needs, being explicit in advertising, creating space to ask in advance. So this is good when we were talking about like the committee. So making someone who's knowledgeable about accessibility needs and the space explicitly available by text, phone, or email. So as many modes of communication as possible, so that people can do what's most comfortable for them to answer access need questions. And if that person doesn't know the answer, saying, honestly, I don't know, I'll find out and get back to you. Accessibility team, having an access point person, asking folks to share access needs in the beginning. So that can be, start with, is like what we did today, my access needs include about my mobility equipment. My access needs are currently being met. And you can repeat that when you do like breakouts into smaller groups. That can be helpful to repeat sometimes in case people forget. So these examples were pulled from a workshop that was created by India Harville. And then some general things to think about. Posing access options as exactly what they are, as options. So for example, those of you who are Unitarians will recognize this. Instead of saying, please rise as you're willing and able, which assumes the norm is standing still, even though there is the option to, sit or whatever, there's sort of an assumed norm in that statement. You might instead say, please join in spirit or in whatever way is right for your body in this moment. Because I am a wordy person, this is a wordy option. Probably you could come up with something more succinct. And then if you're able in certain ways, consider participating in ways that are inclusive rather than alienating. So for example, if you're able to stand, you might consider sitting sometimes, when there's the option to either sit or stand, especially if you are next to someone who can't stand or has difficulty standing. At the same time, please be mindful that as you are working to be inclusive, yes, I realize I used that word there. Please be mindful that you don't take away resources from folks who need them. So for example, lying on the only bed that would be comfortable if you're comfortable sitting somewhere else. And the last thing to think about generally is teaming up. I mean, I think this disability justice for me is just like, it's just the key to so many things. There's so many reasons I love it. And I love thinking about the world through the framework of disability justice. And one of them is that like you have to team up, you have to be part of a community. The whole thing is that we have to hold each other, especially if you're in a situation where there's multiple disabled people working on a project together. Having worked in an organization that was all disabled people, something that we found that was helpful was having a buddy system. So then, if someone is having like a high pain day on the day that they're supposed to like present the workshop, their buddy can then, present the workshop instead. Or if someone, is just like needs to back out of a project at the last minute, it's not like completely dropped. And there's sort of this, like, there's this sharing and there's also like a security in knowing a reduced anxiety in knowing that you're not the only one who's in charge of these big things. So just going to take a couple minutes to ask ourselves this question. Do you believe it's important for the space to have accommodations for people with access needs who don't end up coming or aren't currently part of the community? For example, providing an ASL interpreter, but no one in your usual group has a hearing impairment. Absolutely. Yeah. And childcare is, an access need for sure. Yeah, and it's speaking frankly, it's been really interesting putting together this workshop and realizing the ways that as a social justice coordinator, there are ways that I can be helping both myself and my communities by being more intentional about disability justice. So I have ADHD, which means that I often end up doing things at the last second. And when you're trying to create accessible spaces, that does not lend itself well to creating the most accessible spaces. So it's something I've been thinking about a lot in this process is like, oh, well, how can I maybe pair with other people who like have more of that executive function, like long-term planning skills, where we can like be working together to be like, oh, let's make sure that we're like trying to get childcare like 3 weeks a month in advance, and let's make sure that we're like figuring out funding for ASL and like all these different things. And so it's been interesting doing this work and thinking about like, oh, okay, like I could adjust that and change that. And I think it's a continuing process. So yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and keep going. Da-da-da. So yeah, providing accommodations, even when disabled people are not present, lets us know that this is a welcoming space for us and that we can expect to have our needs met if and when we come the next time, which is pretty much exactly what you said.
Yeah.
And yeah, just something to keep in mind as we're about to like go into this like sort of marathon of access needs. Creating accessible spaces may seem like a really daunting task, and it is. It does take time and resources and collaboration. But each accommodation that is offered is another voice in the room that might otherwise have been lost. So making spaces accessible is a practice in living into our values and creating beloved community, especially I think for those of us in the room who are Unitarian. I think this is really important for us to practice our values in this way. So the following slides are pulled pretty much directly. Most of them are directly from my notes during a workshop presentation by Stacey Abrams and India Harville. So please consider donating to their organizations if you have the means to do so.
The Stacey Abrams?
The Stacey Abrams, yeah, she was my teacher.
Wow.
Yeah, really amazing person.
Oh. Wish her success.
You are too, Anna.
Oh, thank you. You're really sweet. Okay, so pace, space, and senses. So this is sort of the framework that India and Stacey provided to sort of start to think about these things. So pace meaning what's a sustainable pace for the group? How can we move slower? I struggle with that one. How can we be flexible? I'm getting better at that one. And then creating access to access requests in real time. So one access need is the need to access requests. That's a lot of the same word in the same sentence. So what else might we like think about when we're thinking about the pace of a space?
Pace of a space.
Yeah, like so like if you're running an event, you know, like let's say you're running a dinner, what's something you could think about to make things accessible in terms of space, or some questions you might ask yourself? Doesn't have to be a dinner, it could be any event. Yeah, and you know, again, thinking about creating an inclusive space, even if we don't think folks with that would come, but yeah, I think I hear what you're saying about pace. Yeah, something that comes up for me with pace is not even just for an event, but like on a larger scale, like our movement spaces. I've been a part of a lot of movement spaces where there's often an unstated expectation that you're going to kind of go above and beyond to you know, show up to all the protests and do all the lobbying and do, you know, all these different things that take a lot of energy and take a lot of emotional energy. Even within spaces that talk about self-care a lot, which is an interesting word when you think about like, well, how can we make this more of a collective rather than individual experience in a disability justice framework? But anyways, so within those spaces, thinking about what does it look like to move slower? And for myself, as I've been in nonprofits working now for like 9 years, I'm getting to a point where I've seen a lot of my friends burn out. I've seen a lot of them be like, you know what, I can't work in nonprofits anymore. It's too much. There's too much expectation, not enough pay. And they go to corporate or other jobs, you know, and I can't blame them. It's difficult. But so then examining for myself, like, how do I move slowly enough? And what am I in control of where I can move slowly enough to keep being able to do this work? You know, I think those questions are important too. Anything else on pace before we move on to space? Those of you who came to part 1 of disability justice know that this was originally all supposed to be one, and now I'm going to be doing the last part recorded because there's just so much here, and I'm trying to be more flexible. So thank you. So space, who has access to the physical space? And I think also an important one here during COVID times is who has access to the online space, because I know of at least one person who has said, you know, I actually don't want to go to the workshops if they're only online. and because it's just harder for them to access, and that's totally understandable. So you know, something that I've tried to do for that person is like, well, here's the recording. If it doesn't feel doable to be in the space, you know, maybe watching the video afterwards, or and hopefully it looks like our COVID numbers are going down, so I'm hopeful that the next one we can do in person. And then of course there's people who prefer online to in person. So so elements to think about in the physical space: mobility, chemical sensitivities. What else do we need to think about in terms of our space, both physically and online, for accessibility?
Wheelchairs.
Wheelchairs. Yeah, so
Temperature.
Temperature. Ooh, yeah, that's a good one.
I think if people are very uncomfortable, it's hard for them to really like be present and to engage. And just it's also a comfort thing. And some people might be more sensitive to temperature differences, and that both indoor and then especially outdoor.
Yeah.
Sometimes that can even have health implications for people.
Absolutely.
I would say that that light, natural and what kind of artificial light is supplied.
A lot of things to think about. With the chemical sensitivities, that also makes me think about allergies. So yeah, both indoor allergies and outdoor allergies when holding outdoor spaces. Yeah, having multiple different kinds of spaces for sure. Yeah, something at GA that was actually really inaccessible for me was the seating. The like the chairs were super narrow, super hard, and they were chained together, so you couldn't like move them around. And I'm someone where like right now I'm sitting with my feet on a chair in front of me. It's much more comfortable for me to sit that way than the like, I don't know, this weird like 90-degree thing that we try to do all the time. So yeah, so thinking about that too, having different options. So for senses, how do I make the space accessible for people with all kinds of senses? So sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch, as we sort of touched upon, things to consider, noise and light. I think I'm going to go ahead and go to the next one since we talked about senses a little bit, unless anyone has anything pressing they want to share around senses.
Emotional safety.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so if you have your like imagined space ready and or your piece of paper ready, this is sort of where we're going to get into the more rapid fire. I'll probably do about 10 minutes of this and then we'll close. But I think if we can popcorn reading, I think I'll just call the next person to read the next slide and then we'll go from there. So did someone say something?
Talking to the cat. Go ahead.
Okay. So wheelchairs and mobility devices, the basics. So mobility devices are basically things that enable you to move in certain ways. So they can be wheelchairs, they can be crutches, canes, things like that. So these are just some like, you know, like more concrete things to think about in the space. So is the ramp at a gradual incline? So you need a wheelchair ramp. And ramps should be 1 inch of rise to every 12 inches of length, which is a 4.8-degree angle. I've included a link for more detailed ramp specifications. Is the ramp structurally sound? So for motorized wheelchairs and people with larger bodies, you want to make sure that it's really solid. Thinking about the width of the door. So this is when we're getting into, you know, the rules versus practicality, Fred, as we were talking about. According to the ADA, the minimum should be 32 inches. However, wheelchairs can range from 21 inches to 40 inches wide. So I've heard 48 inches as the number for the door. That's better if you can. And then remembering to include enough space for turning within the entrances. And that's for the front door, the bathroom, and other entrances. And I've included a link with more details there. Kelsey, would you like to read the next one?
Sure.
Between the atrium. Oh, it's tiny.
Okay. Can people enter through the front door / or front of the stage? Needing to use the back or side entrance instead can be alienating or othering. Ask questions like, are there random stairs, stoops, or bumps? Is carpeting tacked to the floor? For example, like, will the carpet not bunch up under wheels or create tripping hazards? And is the carpeting thin enough? Do walk / roll through.
Oh, sorry.
Okay, so it's saying to go through to kind of test it out to make sure that the space is actually accessible.
Yes. Yeah. So just like walking or rolling through the full space to make sure it's fully accessible. Because I don't know about other folks, but I've had moments where I think, oh yeah, like that's totally like it's flat all the way, and then it's not going to be an issue for wheelchair. And then I get there and I'm like, oh, there's a step to the front door that I didn't even think about, you know. Mary, would you like to go next?
Wheelchairs and mobility devices in bathrooms. Outward swinging door, 48-inch wide and enough room to turn around. ADA requires 36 and 60 inches wide by 60 inches deep, but bigger is better. Secure grab bars with good grip for maneuvering. Toilet seats are low enough to maneuver to. ADA says no higher than 19 inches, and a flush handle that's reachable. Sinks aren't too high. You don't have to lean to reach something or the soap.
Oh, sorry, the faucet.
Or the soap, and the towels are in easy reach. And I would comment about the toilet too, because sometimes, I mean, for me, I don't like it so low that it's hard to get up off of. But I suppose if there's a grab bar beside it, then that issue changes. But
yeah, sometimes there's conflicting access needs, so having multiple options can be good. Fred, would you like to do the next one? Oh, and I'll, before you jump into that, so just going to do a quick definition. Accessibility for trans, gender nonconforming, and intersex folks. So gender nonconforming can mean folks who are non-binary or gender fluid or just don't ascribe to the gender norms. And intersex folks means folks who are born basically not squarely within the binary for the normative female, I'm putting that in air quotes, body, or normative male, air quotes, body. So go ahead.
Okay, accessibility for transgender, nonconforming, and intersex folks. At least one gender neutral bathroom. And please don't do the half woman, half man sign. It's so cringe. That one.
Yes, so I wrote that as a little commentary. My personal opinion of have you all seen those signs where it's like kind of looks like the half straight person and the half triangle person, and it's just like, no, that's not it. Many people don't, they just don't think of their gender as tethered to the binary at all.
Many people understand their gender as completely untethered from the binary altogether. Let people know if there are single stall bathrooms, trash cans, and menstruation products in all bathrooms. Depending on situations, can offer a buddy system for the bathroom. What does that mean?
So in some situations, like if you're for example, you're meeting in a room and the bathroom is down the hall and there's other groups that maybe aren't as trans inclusive in the same building, you may want to preemptively, as a coordinator, establish like, a buddy system for the bathroom, or let folks know, like, if you don't want to go by yourself to the bathroom, it may be safer to bring someone else. Bathrooms can be sites of violence for transgender, nonconforming, and intersex people. So that's what that's about.
Inclusive and general neutral language as often as possible, i.e. people who are pregnant. Don't assume pronouns.
Thank you. Do you want to pick the next person?
Mary, do you want to do the next one?
Main space, the physical space. Verbalize that people should feel welcome This is what I was trying to say, to move, sit, lie down, stand in whatever ways feel best for their bodies. Point out different options. Create as many accessible spaces as possible for people with limited mobility. More than 1 or 2 empty spaces next to chairs for wheelchair users to be in their chairs. Create many options for people to use. Multiple places to sit, lie down, stand, pillows, blankets available, wide enough aisles and sides and front and back. The ADA says 36 inches, but again, should be at least 48 inches with spaces to turn around, and 60 inches is ideal for passing space. Some chairs with armrests for people to use to help stand up, some without for people who won't fit comfortably into those chairs. Wide, comfortable chairs.
Maria, you want to read lighting? And this will probably be our last one for now.
Yes. Lighting. Fluorescent lighting can cause headaches, trigger seizures, and make spaces inaccessible for people with sensory or neurological disabilities. Alternatives to fluorescent lighting. Lamps, natural lighting. This is a quote, "Flash photography and strobe lights can trigger seizures. Tell people ahead of time if there will be any flashing lights in a film or performance, and give clear instructions to photographers that they are not to use a flash." Again, from Skin, Tooth, and Bones.
Oh, actually, let's quickly do chemical sensitivity. So I'll read this one. So this is around chemical sensitivities. Cleaning is really important to clean regularly to help people with allergies to access the space. You may also run a HEPA filter to clear particles and germs in the air. It's also really good for COVID. Don't use strong or scented chemicals. So one option for cleaning is baking soda and vinegar. Even after, my understanding is even after using strong chemicals, even if it's been like a little while, it can still trigger a response for people with chemical sensitivities. And then unscented soap in the bathrooms is really important. No Febreze or Lysol that people might spray and create scents in the bathroom. If there are scents, some things that you can use to get rid of them are charcoal, damp rid, coffee, and baking soda. And you can set up expectations for people to show up scent-free. And consider how to navigate as a group if people forget and show up having shampooed with, a strong scent or whatever. So examples can be having clothes there to change into, or hair ties for people who have long shampooed hair. For people with chemical sensitivities, that can be triggering to their reactions. In a larger setting, you may want to provide 3 types of seating. The first one being a set for people who have chemical sensitivities. So you can run a fan and a HEPA filter around the area to clear that air of scents. The second set is sort of a moat. So it's of people who are not wearing scents but aren't sensitive, so it's okay for them to sit closer to people who are wearing scents. And the third type of seating would be for people who forgot to come fragrance-free. So that's one option to sort of plan for that. So we'll go ahead and stop there for now. I'm gonna go through and read the rest of these, and I'll send out the recording for that. And because I do want to honor y'all's space and time. Okay, so this is the section of the recording coming back to fill in the sort of gaps that we weren't able to get to during our 3 hours. So creating accessible spaces for neurodivergent people. So neurodivergent is defined as differing in mental or neurological function from what is considered typical or normal, in quotes, frequently used to reference to autistic spectrum disorders, also defined as not neurotypical. So people may consider themselves neurodivergent or neurodiverse if they are folks who have ADHD, autism, dyslexia, OCD, and others. If possible, for folks who are neurodivergent, it is useful to designate a room or space as a low stimulation room. This means that the room has less input for people's brains to process and can be a good space to reset and emotionally regulate if necessary. So that room should have dark or low light. It should be quiet. It's good to make headphones or earplugs available, and it should be a nice calm space. Another thing that can be useful for people who are neurodivergent is having the possibility of doing things virtually, which is much more accessible for some people. Another kind of fun thing that you can do in spaces is you can create color-coded systems that everyone is familiar with. And that allows people to share their access needs without needing to verbalize them. And which can sometimes with folks who are neurodivergent, like it can be difficult to verbalize things, and which means that problems get to a higher scale and get dealt with later, which can be difficult. So color-coded systems can be cards that you tuck into name tags, or they can be stickers, and it can be used for emotional signaling without needing to verbalize. It's also possible to adapt the system for other access needs, like COVID comfort or proximity. So for example, for emotional signaling, you might have green, yellow, and red cards. So green can mean I'm feeling social, my nervous system is regulated, which can mean that that person feels like approachable, like, open to having conversations with folks. Yellow might mean things are a little intense for me right now. Please give me a little bit of space. And red might mean I'm about to melt down. I need to be left alone. I need to go deal with my access needs. Like, please don't talk to me. So that's one example of like the codes that could be. I've also seen green, yellow, and red used for COVID comfort or proximity. So green meaning like, yeah, hug me, like sit next to me, whatever you need. Yellow being like, please wear a mask around me, please be distant or check in with me first. And red being like, please stay 6 feet away from me at all times, wear your mask, don't talk to me. So there's a lot of different ways to use this, and you can kind of have conversations as a community about what kinds of color-coded systems might be useful for your community. Another thing for neurodivergent people, folks with ADHD often need a diversity of activities beyond the typical lecture style presentation in order to stay focused. So creating engaging visual content and activities to break up the event can be really helpful. And yeah, ironically, this presentation is not very ADHD friendly because I did not prepare enough in advance because I have ADHD and procrastinated, and also because I didn't take my own advice to create an accessibility team in advance. We're doing our best. So that's something that I'm, thinking about and building and growing moving forward. And so, so if you want to volunteer to be my accessibility partner, please let me know. I think we could have some fun. Accessible spaces for autistic folks. So needs for people on the autism spectrum are very specific to different people and groups. So always check in about access needs and make someone available for ongoing access needs. Something that's helpful for people who are autistic is having social norms, assumptions, and unsaid rules. Those can often make spaces inhospitable for people. So naming those things can be really helpful. Also having the opportunity to name your needs, or having a facilitator name your needs for you, like talking to someone in advance, can be helpful. And everyone can choose how to do hellos and goodbyes in the best way that feels for them. So for example, don't assume that people want a hug as a greeting. Always ask. We love consent. Oh. Also, card systems, as the previous slide mentioned, can be useful for autistic folks. As with all access needs, they can shift from moment to moment. So having flexibility around this is really important. And resist being offended by people who may ask differently from the group's culture and expectations. Again, those unsaid social norms, assumptions, and rules. can make the spaces inhospitable for folks. So trying to move from a place of compassion and curiosity and weaving that into the culture of your group in general, making space for all different kinds of people can be really good. So creating accessible spaces for people who are deaf, or hard of hearing, and auditory processing issues. So deaf has a capital D and a lowercase d, because the capital D refers to the community and lowercase d is the impairment. So captioning for videos and Zoom meetings. So there's many automatic captioning services that are pretty good now, like on Zoom and YouTube. Definitely at a bare minimum, use this for Zoom if you can. And it's not just for people who are hard of hearing. Captioning can also be really helpful for people who have trouble processing auditory input. So people with ADHD and other things like that. ASL interpreters. So providing interpreters can be really important. This can be really pricey. So considering ways like planning in advance for that, thinking about what you're prioritizing, thinking about how to make these spaces as accessible as possible is really important here. Also, something to consider is that different countries have different sign languages. So if you're providing translation in another language, like in Spanish or Portuguese or whatever, you may also want to provide sign language translation for that language. So that's just another thing to consider for creating accessible spaces. Another thing is having microphones and PA systems for groups of 15 plus people. So making it a habit to pass around the mic. Which can be intimidating at first, but if people have, it can help people to hear better. And I think especially if you're also in a space where people are using masks, it may be helpful to sort of bridge that gap between people needing to lip read and not being able to do that when people are wearing masks, and being able to hear better. Also, microphones are not just about how loud you are, it's also about diction and tonality, also speaking slowly. You may also want to have a second mic that's used only by people who are immunocompromised, and it can be wiped between uses so as not to spread germs, and that's another way to keep people safe. So creating accessible spaces for blind and low vision folks. An important thing is when you introduce yourself, give an image description of what you look like and what you're wearing. Quick note on this is different than identity. So for an image description, rather than saying, for example, I'm a white, cisgendered, queer woman wearing a purple shirt with a green background, you might say instead, I'm a light-skinned person with light hair and green eyes wearing a purple shirt with a green background. So adding the expectation of naming your identities, though sometimes it is useful in other situations, has little to do with what someone looks like, and it can lead to uncomfortable situations for people who might not want to out themselves, whether that's their gender, their sexual identity, or even their disability. If you are presenting visual material, including a brief description of what people are looking at is really good. So like if there's an accompanying photo, describing what the photo looks like. If you're showing a video, you may want to have someone sit next to the visually impaired person and describe what is happening on screen as it plays, particularly as we saw in the video earlier. Sometimes videos will have a quote on screen and they won't read it out loud. So that can be helpful. Also just contextualizing, what's on screen can be helpful. You can also ask people if they would like a tour of the space in advance if you're in a physical space. So showing them where the bathroom is, where the main space is. You may also need to point out more subtle things like uneven floors or, tricky corners or whatever. For written and online materials, really important to include image descriptions and alt text. Okay, what are image descriptions and alt text? So, glad you asked. Alt text is tells people what is in an image, so such as text or basic essential details. So alt text, if you've ever been on a website and an image fails to load, alt text is what will display in its place. So it might be something like, picture of a dog in a green field, right? very short, very to the point. And if you are trying to add this to your online material, usually if you're in an editing program and you right click the image or click options, it'll pop up and there'll be options to add alt text. Whereas an image description is something that is generally typed out and included below the image, usually like in parentheses or italics. So an image description gives more details than the alt text, and it allows someone to learn more about what is in an image that goes beyond the alt text. So for example, for that image before, and I'm just making up an image here, you might say something like, the brown Labrador retriever, image of a brown Labrador retriever rolling on its back with a frisbee in its mouth. In the background is a field of dandelions and a bright blue sky with puffy clouds. You know, something like that, where it's a little bit longer to really paint a picture, so to say. So to find out how to create the most helpful image descriptions in alt text, you can visit this website that I've included here. So image descriptions in alt text, just to help understand the usefulness of them. Sometimes visually impaired people will use screen readers. So basically it's like an automated reader that will literally read out loud the words that are on a screen. And so that's why these kinds of things are important to have, because obviously they won't be able to see the photo, but the screen reader will be able to read them. Another thing about screen readers to keep in mind is if you have text on an image. So if you have text on an image or even some PDFs, screen readers will not be able to read that. So having an alternative where it's like text is written out, and having an alternative where you have the image description, even if it's just like, you know, white words on a black background, like make sure you at least include like the quote as well, so that people are not missing out on those important details. Another important thing for written online materials is having text where the colors are really contrasting. So if the colors, like if you have like a bright red on a bright green, for example, that can be really difficult for some people to read. So you want to have enough contrast in your colors. And you can actually check that. There's sites that will help you to check that. I've included one here. You have to know the RGB values for the colors. So again, that's something that's a little bit more technical that you'll need to kind of research on your own. But another thing you can do is you can try making the image grayscale. So like keep the colors, but like, for example, print it grayscale and look at the PDF of the print in grayscale. And if you're having trouble reading it in grayscale, that's a good indicator that the text is not contrasting enough in color. Okay, so then a couple quotes from Skin, Tooth, and Bone, which also includes more information. I really recommend reading the full accessibility section of Skin, Tooth, and Bone. It goes into more detail about some of these things and includes some stuff that's not included in this presentation. So for visual accessibility, use plain sans serif fonts like Arial or Helvetica. So sans serif means that the letters don't have tails. You think of like typical typewriter font. Sans serif doesn't have those tails at the end, the little sort of like added stuff. Having at least 14-point font, black ink on matte off-white paper is the most legible. There are also fonts that are specifically easier for dyslexic and neurodiverse people to read, including Open Dyslexic and Comic Sans. So this presentation is done in Comic Sans, for example. Also creating a large font, so 16-point or larger, and Braille versions of these programs or handouts that can be made available upon request. So having those ready for people who need them is really useful. Service animals, some quick information. In general, ignore service dogs, just ignore them. Usually don't ask to pet them. They are always working, so don't distract them. Also good to learn each handler, each dog, and their individual preferences, as we've been talking about a lot in this presentation. access needs are very individual to the person. So like learning and having conversations about that is really important. Some information about emotional support animals. Emotional support animals help people feel better emotionally. They can't be discriminated against for housing, at least in California, which is where I got this information. I don't know about Arizona. They are allowed to go on airplanes. They don't have public access, and there's not the formal training that you would have for other kinds of service dogs. Service dogs are allowed almost everywhere. People can't ask for paperwork about your disability. And they can't ask what task the animal is for. The laws mostly provide good privacy and stuff, at least as of 2020, which is when this presentation was happening. I believe they can, they can ask what task the animal is for. So fat people and people of size. So a lot of people have kind of like a knee-jerk reaction when I say fat people. I use that word because having been in fat liberation spaces, a lot of fat people choose to use that word specifically because it is the most straightforward description. It's not, and with the idea that thinking of the word fat as an insult is actually anti-fat, if that makes sense. So I use that term, fat people or people of size. Of course, whoever I'm talking to, I will use whatever their preference is. So for accessibility for fat people, make sure that there are many options for sitting that are comfortable and wide enough for big bodies. And it's the same as accommodations for wheelchairs and mobility devices. Please make sure that the doorways, hallways, and aisles are wide enough. And also the chairs should be sturdy enough too. Okay, so COVID-19 and access for immunocompromised people. So now more than ever, we really have to be making sure that our communities and each other, we're keeping each other safe. We are still in COVID. It is not going away. There are still people dying from COVID, and there are still people developing long COVID. So I think there's sort of a societal belief or kind of underlying thing right now that it's like, oh, we're kind of done now, and we're not done. This is still happening. There are still people who are getting really, really sick from it. So we're already familiar with a lot of the following of these ideas, if you've been paying attention in the past 2 years. Stay home if you have any symptoms of sickness. So even if you don't think they're COVID related, first of all, a lot of symptoms that we don't typically think of as being COVID related actually are now. COVID shows up in a lot of different ways. Additionally, many immunocompromised people have been at higher risk from things like the common cold, the flu, etc., long before this life-threatening pandemic. So even if you don't have COVID, but you are sick, you could still be putting immunocompromised people at risk. So please, if you're feeling sick, stay home. Wash your hands often. Don't touch your face. I also really, 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 really encourage people to practice disability justice by wearing your mask in public. Unless you have, like a medical reason for not wearing a mask, it is not that hard. Please, masks protect the people around you way more than they protect you. So it's really important for us to be doing this for our communities. If you are able to wear a mask, practicing disability justice means always wearing it in public when you're indoors. It literally saves lives. If you're in a smaller group with friends or loved ones, it's important to check in with each person in the room before taking off your mask. And some best practices for holding big indoor events. Require masks. So this makes the space more accessible for some people who might not otherwise be able to come. Also check the COVID rates in your area first. We see big increases and big decreases in COVID. So if your COVID rates are really high, you may consider holding the event online or outdoors instead, or offering a hybrid option so people can join virtually if they're not comfortable coming in person. Also, it's good to let people know the risk factors in advance if you do decide to hold it in person, since many people do not keep track of current COVID rates. So for example, today in Yavapai, our test positivity rate is going down, but according to the New York Times, it is still at 23%, which means that almost 1 in 4 people getting tested are coming back with a positive COVID test, not including home tests. So for context, during Omicron, which we know was a really high spike in COVID, our test positivity rates in Yavapai were around 30%, and the rates were higher than that when I initially decided to hold this event over Zoom instead of in person. Also something to mention, we sort of have a tendency to think of Omicron and other, more recent strains of COVID as less potent. However, again, for people who are immunocompromised or who have pre-existing conditions, they can still be just as deadly. They can still be just as sickening, and it's still incredibly contagious. Zoom. All right, let's talk about online spaces. So for Zoom and online events, it is good to designate at least one person to be the chat monitor and the tech assistants to lift up the comments. For larger events, I definitely recommend splitting this into 2 separate roles. Have one person who's monitoring the chat, who's looking for like raised hands, and have one person who's like helping out with tech, who's like helping you with breakout rooms and answering questions around tech, things like that. It's also good to designate one person to be the access point person for any real-time access needs that arise. People's audio is not working or whatever, that can also be shared between the access point person and the tech person. But in general, when you're holding events, good to have an access point person, at least one person. And that's just someone that people can go to if they have access needs that arise during the event. Also good to offer several options to access Zoom, especially for people who may not be as familiar or comfortable with the technical aspects. So with Zoom, it is possible to dial into meetings from your telephone instead of joining from your computer. So you can call in, you can put in the meeting information, the passcode, all on your phone, and that's more accessible for some people. So making sure people know about that as an option is good. You may also consider having a live stream, so having a link that people can just click on to watch it, depending on the content. If it is a workshop, it's probably good to keep it confidential. So not have the workshop itself live if there's going to be back and forth. But if it's like a webinar, for example, where you're not going to be having input from participants, that may be something you would consider having a live stream. Also good to offer relevant tech information at the beginning of the session. So reminding people how they can raise hands, how they can put information in the chat box, how they can use captioning, use interpreters, etc. Even if you think everyone is already familiar with how to use Zoom, keep in mind that some people may not be able to access all aspects of Zoom, particularly if they are sight impaired. So come up with options for everyone to be able to fully participate. For example, you might say, if you have, like a question that you've shared with the group and you're asking people to share in the chat, you may say something like, please respond to this question in the chat or raise your hand and we'll, pick on you to answer. Also, if you are using other technology during the meeting, like Google Docs, PDF handouts, videos, or other tools, it's good to explain clearly how to use them and to make it as easy as possible to access. So having access points in different places, like pasting the links in the chat, showing them on screen, and even emailing them in advance can help people to access it in the way that's easiest to them. Also allowing time for people who may struggle with this and having people who can help them out to access it. Also offering options, our favorite thing. So offering as many options as possible for people who are more low tech. So it may help, for example, to designate a note taker or other person in small group activities that require collaboration over the screen. So sometimes when I break people out into smaller groups on Zoom, and like, let's say we're all contributing to a Google Doc and we're all writing down our ideas, that's probably not going to be accessible to every person in the space to be able to directly access it. That may not even be because of low tech. It may be because they're on their phone or whatever. So you may phrase that as something like, here's the Google Doc, here's how to use the Google Doc. You can either contribute to it directly or designate someone in your group to add to it. Or I might even just have people right off the bat designate someone in their group to be the official note taker and let people know they can also add their own stuff if they would like. So yeah, offering that as an option is good. So if you want to take some time to think about other access needs that should be added to this list, there is definitely like so much stuff that's missing. There's a lot of things to think about. And again, like checking in with people individually about their access needs, both ahead of time and during the meeting is the best way to make sure that everyone's access needs are being as best met as they can be. So conflicting access needs, this is something that we come across sometimes. So another thing to sort of consider and ask yourselves and chat amongst yourselves, what do we do when one person or people's access needs conflict with another person or people's access needs? So for example, you might have a situation where you're meeting in person, several people in the group are immunocompromised and don't feel comfortable in spaces where there are people who aren't wearing masks, or even in spaces where people are taking their masks off temporarily when they're speaking. However, there may be others in the room who are hard of hearing and they rely on lip reading to understand folks. So this is sort of a question to offer to you to consider, like what are some creative situations we might find in this example, and how do we navigate situations when there are conflicting access needs? I'll just give you a moment to consider that. You can pause the video. And then talking about disability in the workplace. So this is way too big of a subject to fit into one slide, so I'm not even going to try. This presentation is specifically around if you are, hosting access spaces or hosting events or participating in events of some sort. It's not really about disability in the workplace, which is a whole other can of worms. Talking about less exploitable, blah, 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 all of those things. But I will kind of summarize some thoughts on the workplace, which again could be a whole other webinar, by saying, take some time to consider how to make spaces as accessible as possible to people of all abilities, while also keeping in mind the less exploitable model that Leslie EXP shared. So this is more of a question than an answer, but I think that if we can start from this place of, again, holding that complexity of like, we want to make spaces accessible. We want people to be able to access spaces as much as possible. And we also recognize that disability justice and the existence of disabled people shows us the inherent unfairness of a capitalist system, right? Because there are some people who literally cannot work or who are less exploitable, where it's harder for them to produce at the same levels that are expected and required by capitalism in order to survive in a society. So how do we hold those complexities, given that we still live in a capitalist society, given that we still have this work structure, especially if you are in a management position, considering, what's the best way that you can serve the people who you are supervising? What does that look like in the workplace and in society? A lot of questions there. Also, some organizations don't do internally what they do externally. So I've worked in several nonprofits where our labor and organizational practices actually don't reflect the values of the work that we're doing in the world. And this can sometimes show up in the form of unintentional ableism. This is a really interesting thing in organizations, and I'm not the only one who's had these issues. I have friends who actually like have had to stop working at their jobs because even though it's a nonprofit that's whose intention is to make the world better, it's still working under this capitalist framework within these nonprofits. So there are ways that we can reproduce systems of oppression while we're trying to do good. And I think that we see that a lot in spaces like nonprofits and sometimes in social justice spaces too. Or, you know, and for example, this also shows up in terms of representation and leadership. So, you know, working at an organization that is all about serving immigrants, serving Black, Indigenous people of color, but then leadership is white, you know, that's something that you see in nonprofits all the time. So this is something to consider, and to consider like what we're in control of, right? And I think Adrienne Marie Brown teaches us through emergent strategy, which I think I mentioned before. We have the power to create microcosms of the larger world that we want to see, of the larger society that we want to see. You know, it's not just about legislation and these top down whatever. Like, we have power in ourselves right here, right now, to look at our organizations, to look at our communities, to look at our, you know, even family structures, right? And to think about like, how can we, like, what would this look like if we were living in the world that we want to live in, right? And what are we in control of right now to make that as possible as we can? So that's something I think about a lot. Something to consider for yourself when thinking about this question: do you have experience with organizations, groups, or workplaces where the internal culture does not match the stated values? And also, I think that this kind of has to do with sort of this model of service where there's sort of this idea of like us and them, in that we're serving them, right? So it's this externalization of these issues when it's like really like they're all interconnected. Like all of these issues are reproduced in different ways in all of our different interactions and environments and groups and organizations. So I think it's much more useful, instead of thinking about like, oh, how can we serve you, to think more about like, how can we be building a world together that looks more like something that's equitable for all of us, you know? So thinking about that, those experiences you may have had with organizations that, and those internal cultures, how could you imagine that space looking different? What would it look like to throw all the rules out, to throw all the expectations out, and to really think about like, okay, well, what are our values? How do we start from there? You know, in Unitarian spaces, we have the 7-8 principles, right? So how do we take those values and really grow a space from that place? Like, and because rules and laws are really this like top-down structure when you really get down to it, even if they're created by the group, I think it's much more useful. I'm not going to say in all cases, but in most cases, in many cases, to come from less of a rules perspective and to really be more of in a coming from a values base. So asking yourself, is this action that I'm taking within this community coming from my values? And in Unitarian spaces, we have the concept of covenanting, right? We create sort of an agreement which is based in values. So less, am I following the rules, but more, am I in covenant? And am I, you know, working from these values and these agreements that we created as a community? And what does that look like in a space, including in the workplace? So anytime that we're talking about accessibility, we of course have questions of time, convenience, money, safety, and other perceived and real barriers to creating accessible spaces. Again, this could be a whole other workshop. But just really briefly, what are some examples of times when one or more of these issues, so again, time, convenience, money, or safety, gotten in the way of creating accessible spaces? I think something that we are often we come head to head with is this idea of, oh, that's impossible, right? And so things can be impossible because like there's not enough time. Things can be impossible because really what it is it's not convenient. It's impossible because there's not enough money, or it's impossible because it's unsafe. One of the big arguments, as we saw in Judy Heumann's book, Becoming Human, when she's a wheelchair user, and when she was trying to get a job teaching in the New York school system, the answer she got was that she was a fire safety hazard to the children, and that was why she couldn't have a job teaching in the school system. And I think this is also especially prevalent and has a lot of crossover with queer issues right now, in the ways that the quote unquote safety of children is being weaponized in order to oppress certain groups of people. We see that with laws about kids not being allowed in drag spaces, or not being allowed to learn about LGBTQ issues, with some concept of like that's keeping them safe somehow, which again is like, well, why are we unsafe? Is really what it breaks down to. So anyway, so that there's connections across different issues with a lot of these issues with safety in particular. So what are some examples of times when one or more of these issues have gotten in the way of creating accessible spaces? Can you think of a time, or even like something you would want to do in your space and barriers that you would envision coming up around these things? I'll give you a moment to think about that. You can pause the video if you'd like. So having thought about that, how can we come up with creative solutions to these issues? Again, going back to that quote by Judy Heumann, anything is possible when you assume it's possible. I'm totally misquoting it. But that idea that it's like, we have to assume that things are possible. We have to start from that framework. So what are some creative solutions? Like you being realistic about like, these are the barriers, perceived or real, that we have to creating these spaces. What are some creative solutions around that? What are some ways that we could find around that to make spaces more accessible? All right. And we have made it back to the slides. Woohoo. And I wanted to sort of share this one on social justice and ableism. So we talked about this briefly, but I think specifically within this group, since we are, change makers, and we're invested in social justice and environmental justice, talking, like really being intentional about, if our goal is for body autonomy for people, if our goal is to have all bodies welcome in a space, all bodies like present, like how do we really examine and think about like how we're doing social justice culture, whether there's certain kinds of work that we're considering more important than other kinds of work, and how can we be showing up for each other as a community more intentionally. So I picked another quote from Skin, what's it called? Skin, Tooth, and Bone. If you want to go ahead and read it, Joe.
Sure. We all have bodies, hearts, and minds. We all have needs and capacities, strengths and vulnerabilities. A disability justice approach to mixed ability organizing means coming together across difference and inequality to build another, more liberated world. We work with and through the complexities and messiness that inevitably arise in this coming together. We patiently create new practices through conversation and experimentation, through trial and error. A disability justice approach to mixed ability organizing offers new forms of interdependence. We invest our energy in each other so that nobody is left behind.
Mm-hmm. And there's one more piece of that. Kelsey, could you read that for us?
Sorry, I disappeared for a moment. Is it the whole paragraph?
Yeah.
Okay.
Couldn't see your picture. Go ahead.
Mixed ability organizing requires us to identify and bridge between different capacities, orientations, and relationships of power. It means paying attention to and being honest about the complexities of being in a body and developing practices capable of attending to that complexity. For instance, while people with different disabilities may share a common experience of oppression under ableism, it can also be true that particular contexts can provide for the access needs of some and not others. A particular meeting space may present difficulties for people with mobility impairments, while a particular style of conducting a meeting may be difficult for people with emotional or cognitive impairments. These complexities play out not only across disabilities, but across race, gender, sexuality, class, and so on. For mixed ability organizing to honor the principles of disability justice, it must be able to take stock of, engage with, and work through these complexities.
Yeah, and complex it is when we start to believe that all our bodies are different and we all have different needs, things get complex. Yeah, so just some, closing thoughts on facilitating spaces. We're not perfect. It's okay. That I think is another one of the sort of the points of disability justice, right? Is that we will keep growing. And yeah, perfect is not a useful concept in these kinds of spaces. So, I myself am still learning how to best facilitate these spaces centered in disability justice. I make mistakes, I'm growing. As I mentioned before, ironically, these slides are not the most ADHD friendly. If I had more time, I would have, added more pictures and I don't know, GIFs and videos and things. Another thing that I mentioned, captions are not a perfect solution if you have auditory disabilities. We were really lucky to have an ASL person today. I'm hoping to continue to do that for future workshops. And there's a slide that, was back there around that we didn't get to, that was talking about these sort of barriers, which I think is really important to name and to think creatively about, right? And one of them is money, right? One of them is having the funds to pay someone to interpret or other things that can make a space more accessible. So if you have ideas, I would love to hear them. And then again, yeah, Zoom is hard for some people to access at all. So it's not perfect. We're doing our best. We're growing. We're continuing to keep doing what we can. Slow is good. Flexibility is good. We can't do this alone. And yeah, thinking about what does it look like to lean on each other in our communities to create more accessible spaces. An important part of that is how do we make sure disabled labor isn't being undervalued or underpaid, while also moving away from a capitalist framework and creating these spaces. So again, with that complexity of how do we, knowing what we know about those statistics, right? Knowing that disabled labor is consistently undervalued, how do we help that while also working towards a world where you don't have to work to survive. Yeah, we're messy, we're imperfect, we make mistakes, and we are still in this together. So creating accessibility is inherently about creating a more liberated and connected world. I think what I try to do with my advertising is to advertise what I'm providing. So for example, hopefully what'll go on my advertising is childcare, ASL, and then reminding people to wear masks when we're meeting in person, those kinds of things, and scent free. And then if there is something longer like that, about the space itself, I think it would be really great for Granite Peak to develop, a page on our website that we can just link to on our advertisement that has all of that updated stuff, because then people can look at that and then call if they have questions. I'm just really grateful, as always, to this wonderful community. Thank you for sticking it out till almost 9 on a Thursday. I will definitely let you all go now, but there's so much wisdom in this space, and I really appreciate you all. And I'll just share this reading before we close out. And I apologize, it's going to be really small to try and read. Oh, there it is. Okay. So this is from a book called Held, Blessings for the Depth. I really love this book. It's a book of queer queer blessings, basically. It's put together by queer folks. The fall, Cassidy Hart. The ground has shifted. Roads lead to free falls, and dirt turns to quicksand, and even the night sky is unfamiliar. Bless the breaking, the borders crumbling in your hands, the knowing fractured into pieces too small to gather again. If you ever knew what you wanted, it's gone now. Bless the falling. Let all your conflicting desires scatter like stars, shaped into misremembered constellations. They'll watch over you without demands. Bless the grounding. You already have everything necessary woven through your skin and blood and every woven through your skin and blood and every cell. Your own body holds you, and you are free to fall into the waiting embrace of what you need.
Wow. Thank you for that.
Wow. I appreciate you all so much. And yeah, I'll see you at the next one. The next one will be the first Thursday of September, which I don't know what the date of that is, but I think it's September 1st. So I hope to see you there. Yep, September 1st.
Okay.
Thank you all for being so wonderful.
Thanks, everybody.